Good morning, everybody. It's Half Past Ridiculous, and we're seeking Essentio Mantium. Last week, because of stress and a whole bunch of other things, recording didn't get done, so we'll just do a quick recap of what we went through last week, and that was the concepts of jurisdiction. Now, in the chat, the text chat, you'll find a link to a web page called The 7 Elements of Jurisdiction, and this is what we're working with at this time. And just as a recap, we'll just quickly go through the 7 elements and have a look at those. The first one, the accused must be properly identified in such a fashion that there's no room for mistaken identity. Pretty clear, pretty obvious. Shouldn't be a whole lot of questions surrounding that. If they don't know who you are, how can they say you did something? The second one, the statute of offense must be identified by its proper or common name. A number is insufficient. This is not necessarily on a ticket, because they do that on the ticket all the time, but actually on the charging instrument, which is the piece of paper that the court relies on for its actual, what's the word I'm looking for? Ability to act. They have to have this charging instrument. Now, there's a number of things. We'll go over a charging instrument in a later show. It can get really complicated, but there's a number of things that have to be on that instrument. The number 3, the acts of alleged offense must be described in non-prejudicial language and detail so as to enable a person of average intelligence to understand the nature of charge. The actual acts or act constituting the offense complained of. So, I mean, you have to understand, you have to be able to comprehend what they're complaining about. If they use a whole bunch of Latin words in there, you have no idea what you're even being charged with unless you go and do your research, which you should be doing anyway. The number 4, the accuser must be named. He or she may be an officer or a third party, but some positively identifiable person or human being must accuse. Some certain person must take responsibility for the making of the accusation, not an agency or an institution. This is one of the most important ones to remember. If you're being charged by the Crown or the province of or the people, no one is actually taking responsibility for those charges. So you have no recourse. If the charges turn out to be false, too bad, so sad. You're out of luck. Nobody is going to go down for making false charges. And historically, what this was intended to do was to stop vexatious charges, where people who are just pissed off at somebody would make up some ridiculous charge to nickel and dime these people to death and just make their lives miserable. And that's what that is intended to avoid. But most people, at least these days, they don't realize this, and they get some sort of charge in the mail and it's from the Crown. They don't realize the Crown, you can't call the Crown up and cross-examine it. You can't call the Crown up and go, look, let's settle this matter out of court. It doesn't work that way because the Crown doesn't exist. It's a concept. It's a piece of paper. And you can't contract with a piece of paper. Number 5, the accusation must be made under penalty of perjury. Again, along with number 4, you have to take responsibility. If you're going to charge somebody, you have to take responsibility for it. You have to put yourself on the line. Yes, this is true. This is accurate. Just to stop vexatious charges. Number 6, to comply with the 5 elements above, that is, for the accusation to be valid, the accused must be accorded due process. The accuser must have complied with the law, procedure, and form in bringing the charge. So you can't just jump up and down and stomp your feet and go, he did it, he did it, he did it. You have to actually do the process correctly. And unless you know, from the other side of it, unless you know what the correct process is, you won't actually know if they did it right. And most of the time, they don't. Most of the time, if you ask for a charging instrument, they won't have it. If you ask for, to face your accuser, you can't, because the vast majority of times, especially with statutory charges where there's no victim, it's just you did it and now we're fining you. There's no one is taking responsibility for that. So there are ways of getting around this. And number 7, the court must be one of competent jurisdiction. To have a valid process, the tribunal must be a creature of its constitution, in accord with the laws of its creation. So if you're being charged with an offense under the CDSA, you can't go to a civil court. It's not a competent jurisdiction. If you're being charged with doing harm, you can't go to a commercial court because it's not of competent jurisdiction. The court, whatever court you're in, must be geared towards the system of law that you're working with. The vast majority of courts, actually all of the courts in Canada right now, are admiralty courts. So if you're dealing with matters of harm, the admiralty court is actually not of competent jurisdiction. They're not technically allowed to hear the matter at all. In that case, when it's harm, the proper way to do it is a de jure court of the people, which doesn't exist anymore. The concept still exists, but nobody knows how to create them, or very few people know how to create them. And because they're such a strange animal, the sheriffs don't support them. The lawyers won't support them because they're not even allowed to speak in a common law court because they are entirely admiralty. So in order to get that to function, it's very, very difficult. I'm sure it's doable. I don't know anybody who's actually accomplished it. They've tried it. There was a number of places that tried it, but even though they came up with their findings and they found these people guilty and all of this stuff, nothing ever came of it because none of the so-called authorities would even listen to the decisions. It's a kangaroo court, they're not going to listen to this crap. So that's basically it. But there's some clues in there. If you study these 7 elements of jurisdiction, most of the time you can find some defect in their process that you could use to your advantage to derail their process. Carl, I'm sure you've run into this a few times, especially with your training, that in what you used to do, you would have to establish jurisdiction at that point. I know some of it you could assume jurisdiction. You could just assume, well, yes, because I'm a police officer, I have jurisdiction. But I'm sure that there were some instances where you had to actually get the person you were talking to give you jurisdiction. Is this correct?
Yeah, sure is. Although typically the training teaches you procedures and a certain sequence of events and information that has to be provided during those events, which gives you the opportunity or the authority to carry out whatever it is that you intend, either arrest or a summons, or more usual these days, give you a ticket. But yeah, the unfortunate thing is that they don't call it jurisdiction as far as the teachings in the police, and probably even in law school. I think what it's all about now, I think, is procedures. You follow these procedures, you do this, you get what the desired response is, and this is the end result. Yeah. Realistically, it's jurisdiction, but they don't call it that, because when people look into jurisdiction, and the 7 elements in particular that we've just briefly discussed here, but went in great length last week, you actually realize and understand that all 7 elements of those jurisdiction are required.
Yes.
Not just one of them. You need all of them. So if you can throw a spanner into their procedural points and do away with even just one of those, and you challenge jurisdiction, then you have no case to answer. And this is why a lot of what we're trying to teach to everybody, or at least inform everybody about, is how simple, to some extent, it can be to gain your power back and throw a wrench in their plans. And you have to have some nerve, I must admit, to stand up in court, because it's all pomp and circumstance. You know, and in the higher courts, it's men with robes and wigs and all sorts of things. So that there are a number of things that you personally have to get over to make this happen. I think in the long run.
Most definitely, and they certainly throw fear and confusion into the mix. They will try to confuse you big time. From a man on the street perspective, the very first thing any of these people will ask you for is identification. And no one.
They want your name and address, typically.
Well, they want evidence of a fiction. I was just going to get into this. No one on the planet is obligated to have identification. Your face and your signature are your identification. That's it. The cards you have in your wallet, which, by the way, are not yours. If you look at the card, if you look at the driver's license or look at your bank card, it says right on it, this is the property of whoever, gave it to you. So it's not your license. It's not your bank card. It belongs to the bank, and you are simply authorized to possess it and use it in a commercial fashion. When they are asking for identification, they're looking for two things. They're looking for the name, and they're looking for a birth date. Those are the two primary things that are there. And we discussed this last week. No one, and I mean no one, can swear they know the date of their birth. It's not possible. You can swear that you know what you've been told it is, but you cannot swear that you rightfully swear you know the day of your birth, because the moment you begin breathing, you don't know what a calendar is. You don't know what a day is. You can't do it. It's not possible. And it's been shown over and over and over again. Excuse me. If you do not have identification, if you do not provide identification, at least not the kind of identification they're looking for, they have a very, very hard time bringing charges. And most of the time they just stop. It goes in with something else we just briefly touched on, and that is don't talk to the police. You don't have to answer questions. You have a right to remain silent. And if you simply don't answer any questions, you can't incriminate yourself. You can't give them any tools, any of their little word game tricks that they use to gain jurisdiction. And that's essentially all that they're looking for. Because we live in, we've been imposed upon by Admiralty law, which is entirely commerce, entirely contract. It's fiction against fiction, not fiction against living flesh, because that is absolute fraud. And if you look at the, which one is it? Number 4 of the 7 elements of jurisdiction. It must be a flesh and blood human being bringing the charges. So if they're going to bring charges against you, ask them, are you doing this? And then you hold them personally liable for the charges. And if enough people do this, they will just stop doing it, because the police officers do not want to be liable for their actions. And even though they are, they always find a way around it, because most people don't realize that they can hold these individuals liable for their decisions, for their actions.
Yeah, unfortunately, again, from my own experience, I know that the police are given very, very little information, and a lot of officers on the street who may be very aware of this information, they've only established that from experience, let's say, and from doing their extra research and due diligence about the job it is that they're doing, rather than just following orders. So, as I was mentioning, they will follow a certain set of procedures, but you throw a monkey in that, then it's going to stop them. It may not stop them very much. They may just say, screw this, and call their supervisor. But the point is that if you can establish a roadblock in their procedures, then you could potentially get away with being persecuted or prosecuted by the police and the law system later on. And as John mentioned there, identification is a big factor in that one. The first things that any officer will ask you for, well, except in a motor vehicle, it's typically the license first, but because that's contract, the fact that you provide the license, you've already given all of your previous contractual agreement, because you now have a driving license.
That's right.
But in the case of any other summary conviction, let's say, here's an ideal one. You're walking down the street and you drop litter on the floor. And an officer comes over and, firstly may ask you to pick it up, or just say, that's littering. What's your name? What's your date of birth? And what's your address? Well, if you don't give him any of that information, how is he going to give you a ticket?
Yeah. I mean, if you are arrested, then yes, you have to give them the information they're looking for. But you can do so in such a manner that it kind of screws their commercial system up. If they ask
again, it's still there, John. It's still there. Yes, you might well be arrested, certainly for something that is an arrestable offence. They then have to go about identifying you. But if it's not an arrestable offence, you still have no, even for a summary conviction, I don't think you have any requirement to identify yourself. And if you don't have any identification on you, the cards, the driving licence, or anything, it doesn't matter. If it's a bank card and it has your name on it, then they can go from there. And if you don't speak to the police officers and you don't have any requirement to, you could simply ask the question, am I being detained?
Yeah, and that comes down to...
We go back to that.
I think we discussed that in the first show. And
we did, exactly, yeah.
Which a lot of people do that wrong. They ask the questions in such a manner as they're giving that officer more authority. Am I being detained? No. Am I free to go? Well, don't ask them if you're free to go. If you ask them, first of all, I wouldn't ask, am I being detained? I would ask, why are you detaining me? And if they say, well, I'm not, it's over at that moment. Thank you, goodbye, walk away. Because they've already told you you're free to go, you're not being detained. If you go, why are you detaining me? You're giving them tacit authority to detain you. And because
well, at that point they'll just say, well, you've dropped litter and I'm going to give you a ticket. That's the reason that you've been detained. But then you have to get out of the next set of procedural points, which is providing your name and your date of birth and your address and so on.
Yep.
So.
Yep, and the date of birth is an easy one. If they demand a date of birth, just say, look, I'm not committing perjury. I don't know. I cannot swear to that information, so I refuse to provide it. And they can't really argue with that because you're not incriminating yourself. You're not committing perjury. But even if they do manage to get some ID, some identification, or get a name out of you, if they convert that to a legal fiction, if they ask you for your name and you go, I'm commonly called John, and they convert that to a legal fiction, that's identity theft. And they know exactly what that is. And when you bring it up, they get really nervous.
Well, it's actually personage, isn't it? The legal term that you used is full legal term. I think it's personage.
Probably. I don't know the exact legal term. This isn't something that I've had to had to pursue because it's never got that far. Typically just reminding them that failure to distinguish between law and statute is gross negligence equal to fraud. They don't want to deal with you anymore because they realize at that moment you actually know what you're talking about and probably know more about it than they do. And unless it's really serious and they have, like they're trying to impress their buddies, chances are they're just going to stop at that point. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. It depends on the situation, of course, always.
Yeah, I think the seriousness of the crime that they intend to pursue against you has a lot to do with how much effort they're really going to put into this. If it's a $500 ticket, then they might impress their bosses and they might try to push this a little further. If it's an actual crime that they believe has been committed under statute, codes law, again, they may, if they can't identify who you are, they may detain you for the purposes of identification, which is something that they can do for, more serious offences. But again, you don't have to say anything. Because if it is an arrestable offence, they're going to caution you or Mirandize you in the US. And at that point, you do exactly what they just told you. You don't have to say anything.
And don't say anything. It doesn't matter what doesn't.
So don't ever.
There's a number of YouTube videos on this, and there's one fella, I don't know his name, but he's put out.
I put the link in the chat. Actually, it's the university. The law professor at the university.
Yeah, don't talk to
I've actually put the link in the chat there.
Yeah, and the second half of that video is actually a working police officer who comes in and says, "Don't do it. This is why. This is how we do it," and it goes through the whole process of how they get you. But what I'm referring to, there's another fella, I believe he's a truck driver, down in the States, and he's been doing this for quite a while, and there's a whole bunch of YouTube videos on this. Basically, he'll get stopped. He'll roll down his window. The cop will ask him a question, and he'll just say, "I don't answer questions." And he sticks with it. He will not answer questions because as soon as you answer their question, you're now the slave. They are now the master. They have control, and they assume control. Like, I don't answer questions. Well, why don't you answer questions? Well, I don't answer questions. Right? Don't answer the question. If you're
circular logic at that point.
That's right. If you're going to say you don't answer questions, don't answer questions. Simple as that. And there's a number of these videos. They're directly recorded dash cam stuff. I don't answer questions. Okay, thank you very much. Have a nice day. And he drives away. It sucks that we have to do this, but some of the officers, some of the people who are out there supposedly protecting us, but they're actually protecting the corporations. They may not even realize it. They get put in really, really horrible situations, and I feel sorry for them. It sucks that it has to happen, but they need to learn. They need to realize what's going on. And most of these guys, Carl, you brought it up a number of times, they're just not taught this stuff. They're taught, eat your steroids, eat lots of beef, be big and bulky, be big and scary, and don't take crap from anybody. Rather than look at the limits of your authority. Where does your authority end? And they're never taught that. And unfortunately, it's up to us as regular Joe Average to teach them where their authority ends, which is unfortunate, to say the least.
Yeah, but if we don't do this, and this is the point of why we want to do these shows, isn't it, John? We simply want to make sure that all these people out there that are succumbing to the police state and their overreaching authority, under the guise of protectionism, typically, is nothing of the kind. It's simply a way of, it's indirect taxation. They want money out of you.
Well,
and the more money they can get, the better. But they also want the control. Higher up, the whole idea behind this is simply to control the populace. And and you have to stand up for yourself, lose the fear. And the only way you can lose the fear is have the knowledge of how the system works, so that you can use it to not necessarily benefit you, but at least put a stop to you and the people that you know from being
victimized.
Just victimized. Yeah, exactly. And that's what it is. You become victimized. So yeah, the whole process that we want to get across to you guys out there listening is to help you lose that fear.
Yeah, I mean, to paraphrase a very powerful quote, I can't give you the actual quote because I don't remember it exactly. But to paraphrase, it's the problem is not that evil exists; it's that good people don't do anything about it. And this is what the show is all about: is to show people there is things you can do about this, and we need to do this. We need to stand up and make sure that the right thing is being done. Now we'll step into the next topic here, and which is we're going to be looking at licensing. What is licensing? Why do you need it? What's it for? How they use it? All of this stuff, and this ties in with the right thing. Now, specifically, let's look at a driver's license. What is a driver's license? Well, first of all, let's look at the definition of a license. Black's Law, 2nd edition, reads, in the law of contracts, a permission accorded by a competent authority conferring the right to do some act which without such authorization would be illegal or would be a trespass or a tort. Driving. Okay, how is getting in an automobile and taking your kids to soccer illegal, a trespass, or a tort? What mechanism is required in order to say that has to be a licensed? You need permission to take your kids to soccer. We have a right to travel. It's in all, it's all the foundational documents. We have a right to travel, and if you search through this, I've got some documentation on my computer that goes through this in great detail. If you look through this process, what you'll find is that there are hundreds of court cases which state, yes, you have a right to travel in the conveyance of the day. A fella, Pringle, what's his, can't remember, this guy in California during the Reagan era, Charlie Sprinkle. He was one of the very first people to do this, and essentially he challenged it right up to the president, and he actually had a lawsuit against Reagan and his wife, which if they acted upon it, they would prove their criminal intent. So they couldn't do anything about it. They couldn't touch this guy. He's got some YouTube videos explaining what he did, how he did it, tells some stories about it. And essentially, you have a right to travel. So what part of that, traveling down the road in an automobile, would be considered illegal, a trespass, or a tort? Now, a tort is actually causing harm. We know as long as you're careful and you follow the rules, the basic safety rules of the road, so you're not driving on the left-hand side if you're in Canada, and you're not doing, 6 times faster than everybody else, and you're just going with the flow, acting like everybody else, and nothing untoward happens, there's no tort. You're not causing any harm, loss, or damage. Is it a trespass? Well, it's a public road. You have a right to access a public road. So there's no trespass. So, where would be the requirement of the license? When you break it down, the license is for drivers. Now, a driver is a commercial entity. A bus driver, a truck driver, an ambulance driver, a delivery driver. Taxi driver. Someone who's using the roads as their place of business. Okay, so you're using a public resource for private gain. This is the trespass. This is what is required, or why you're required to have a license, because it is permission to use the public roads for private gain, so you can make a living on it. If you're not earning money traveling down the road, you're not in a commercial situation. You are simply exercising your right to travel. Rarely does this ever get distinguished. And a couple of cases
these days it's ever, John, because they again it's the assumption of the jurisdiction that because you happen to be in a vehicle, a registered vehicle, on the road, that they have the authority to do with you as they please.
Yeah.
And they've not told. Well, actually, if I remember back to my training, which is 30 years plus ago now. 35 closer. When I was going through the training, I do remember questioning certain aspects because they mentioned without lawful authority as part of the legislation itself. Now, I was told that simply means defence. Well, if it's defence, then why didn't they say defence and not lawful excuse or other lawful authorities? So there are certain things that I have become aware of in my early stage that calls into question how this is done. But again, it's procedure. You follow this certain set of questions and procedures. You automatically gain jurisdiction, which then allows you to issue the ticket or do whatever needs to be done, issue the summons, or if it's severe enough, then you arrest them.
Yeah,
and that's where we need to get away from.
Well, we can. There's ways to do this because everything is contract, especially in this country. I mean, everything is contract. You can make a contract. And we touched on this over the last two shows. We kind of touched on it on both shows, where you can send them a notice, say this is what I intend to do. Tell me why I can't. Under penalty of perjury and under oath and penalty of perjury, to the what would be considered by the establishment to be the competent authority. And most of the times you won't. So you can, through a certain process, you can get or obtain a lawful excuse, which will stand up. And if you do, you may still get arrested and hauled in and charged and everything, and then you bring up this contract. Look, I'm under contract. If this goes through, these people are liable for it because this is our contract. And because everything is contract, they understand that language. It's much easier to deal with. Rob Menard, who got me started on this path years and years and years ago, he tells a story, and I don't recall exactly what the circumstances were, but anyway, he's in, I believe, North Vancouver, doing whatever he does, just lawfully sitting there, minding his own business. A cop comes up, questions him, goes through the whole spiel, gets his name, types his name in the computer, and Rob noticed, because he's standing at the window, that on the computer it said no statutory charges without express written consent of the Attorney General. And this is because he had contract with the Attorney General that he was not liable for statutory charges. And anybody can do this, but you have to do it right. And there is a procedure. We will go over this procedure in future shows. There's a lot of paperwork involved. You have to write it in such a way. But essentially, you're simply creating your own private contract with these people. And if they can't, everybody knows that everybody knows this process already. It's public notice. If you want to paint your fence purple and you think your neighbors are going to bitch, you put up a public notice. I'm going to paint my fence purple. Tell me why I can't. If nobody says you can't, you can. And nobody can bitch about it because they have the opportunity to say, no, this is why. Nobody said anything. You have a right at that point to paint your fence purple. You can do the same thing.
This is what happens in the local municipalities and local townships. They usually publish something in the paper that they've got a certain works or a certain project that they're scheduling, and they'll put a notification in the local newspapers, along typically with a town meeting that gives everybody the opportunity to come and say yay or nay. And if, this 50-story building goes up in the middle of a small town, and you complain afterwards, well, we put a notice, you didn't come, so tough.
That's right.
That's it.
That's right.
That's the notification process.
That's right. And we can use exactly the same process. You have to direct it in the right way. Rob was traveling to Ontario, and he sent a letter to each of the municipalities that he's going through, to the police chief of each municipality, saying, look, I'm going to be lawfully traveling through in an unregistered, unlicensed automobile. So therefore it is not a motor vehicle, because as soon as you license and register an automobile, it becomes a motor vehicle. Tell me why I can't. Nobody said anything. He drove all the way across Canada, didn't have a lick of trouble. In a small town, you're probably easier to get away with this in a small town than in a large one, because everybody knows each other. You can actually go and talk to the cop, and you probably went to school with him, and just say, look, why can't I do this? Well, it's illegal. Well, why is it illegal? Right? I have a right to travel, correct? Well, yes. Well, then why can't I travel? Why is it illegal? And typically you can come to some sort of understanding. You can come to some sort of meeting of the minds in that respect. In the larger cities, it's all paperwork. And the paperwork, you have to do the paperwork correctly, because it has to be a bulletproof paper trail. You have to guarantee that you can prove they got it, they didn't respond to it. So you need third parties, and you need disinterested parties, and somebody else has to serve it. And it can be a bit of a nightmare, but it is doable. And there have been people in Canada who have done this, and they're still traveling. They've got private on their, private, non-commercial, not for hire on their cars, and they're left alone now. But yeah,
one of the rules, or one of the notices that I was taught in my legal training early on as a cop was that certainly in initial times, private vehicles used to have signs in the back of them that said private conveyance, not for hire or reward, just as something as simple as that. And that distinguished you from a driver, which was obviously somebody who was on the road. It'd be a taxi cab or, a lorry driver, delivery driver, that kind of thing. They were using it for the purposes of businesses. Yeah. Now they lump you in all under one. Everybody is a driver. But that's partly because of the licensing and registration process, which is where they trick you.
Yep, and nobody questions that. You have to register your car. Well, why? What's the point? Why? What does that actually do? I want in writing what actually the registration does, because I don't understand what this is. And you got to start right from day one, and we need to educate the frontline people, because the frontline troops don't have a clue for the most part. They follow a procedure. They have a script. If you take them off script, they freak out, turn red, and run away. And then you're dealing with some guy with a gun. Because, I went through this at the post office. I went down to, I got a thing in my mailbox. I went down to the post office, and the first time I did this, I went down with my self-generated identification, which is a lawful identification. It doesn't identify the fiction, it identifies me. And that was sufficient for them. The second time I went down, no, that wasn't sufficient. They wanted government ID. They wanted me to identify a government, which I am not governed. I fired the government years ago. Because you're not obligated to be governed. Okay, this is another thing that people have to understand. You are not obligated to be governed. You can, as long as you are competent to govern yourself, you don't cause harm, loss, or damage, you don't need to have somebody tell you how to live. And they didn't like that at all.
Put you all under a social contract, which supposedly exists, but nowhere in law can we find that this social contract actually does exist, unless you sign up for it and agree that it does exist. But if you don't, then no, you can govern yourself. And that, again, is the point of all the information that we're trying to provide.
Yeah, and, whenever someone says you have an obligation, question it. Because unless you have done something to harm someone else, at which point, yes, you do have an obligation. You have an obligation to make amends. But if you're walking down the street and some guy says, well, you're not allowed to walk south to north on this side of the street, we're charging you $500. Well, excuse me? You're going to have to justify that. You're going to have to prove that to me. Because it's just totally fishy. And if you really look at the statutes, the vast majority of the statutes in this country, I think there's 60 million of them. They're just bullshit. They're nothing more than revenue generation. They don't stop harm. They don't stop loss for the most part. And they have nothing to do with other living flesh human beings. If you walk across the street and you don't use a crosswalk, it's called jaywalking, and there's a fine involved in that. If you do so and the street's empty and there is absolutely no damage, you have inconvenienced no one. Where's the offense? Where is the jurisdiction to charge you money to cross the street? Right? People don't think about this stuff, and you need to look at what's going on. Now, if you cross the street off a crosswalk and it's a busy road and squealing brakes and cars are sideways, and you're causing problems, certainly. But if you haven't caused a problem, if you haven't caused anyone any issues, where's the offense?
Yeah, and that brings into the discretionary powers of a police officer on the street.
Oh, that annoys me to no end.
I know exactly. Partially why I brought it up, because if there's a law on the books, then if there's a discretion to ignore it, then the law is not all-encompassing.
That's right.
It can't be, because if you've got discretion to ignore it and overrule it, then that's where you stand on that one.
That makes that cop the judge, and he is not qualified to do that. First of all,
well, that's the same with tickets. That's always frustrated me with the fixed penalty tickets, because that you're literally judge, jury, witness, everything all tied into one, and that had always frustrated me, even as a cop, because if I was going to issue any kind of a ticket to anybody, it would be through means of a summons, and I would go through the process. But the last thing I wanted to do was start handing out fines on the street, because that, to me, I wasn't acting in my role as a police officer and a member of the community. I was acting as the judge and jury all in one go.
Yep. There was a thing that came up through the World Freeman Society when I was the chief administrative officer there about the tickets, about the traffic tickets. And one of the things about it was the concept of presentment. Now, when they give you a ticket, you're not getting the original, you're getting a copy of the ticket, which is, as far as presentment goes, an inactionable instrument. You can't go and pay that ticket. You have to have the original in order to settle that matter lawfully, correctly, according to the rules.
Yeah, now here we're actually going into the aspects of bills of exchange, I think, and the monetary system.
Yeah, well, it's all tied together.
Yeah, it is. But yeah, for the listening public, this is something that is also known and part of the system, but it's never taught to you, and you can't action this anyway, simply because you're not given the original. You'll never be given the original in this respect, because in the true sense of the word, you can discharge that ticket simply by signing it and potentially adding a certain set of words to it, which will then discharge that notice out of the system. But because you get the copy, you that doesn't happen. You can't do it.
Yeah, the verbiage is accepted for value, returned for
return for value.
Well, it's a little more than that. The return for settlement, discharge, and closure. And I mean, it's something that's called a banker's acceptance. And if you're going to look it up, it's really hard to find this information, but if you do, it's absolute gold. Now, whether or not you're going to be able to use it, because these folks don't, most of these guys, especially the judges, they don't even follow their own rules. So whether you can use it is another story, but it is there. It's on the books. When you go to a restaurant, they are supposed to hand you a bill. Now, a bill has a very specific format. If it's not in that format, it's an invoice. It's a statement. But if it's a bill, all you need to do is sign it, consumer purchase, as long as it is a consumer purchase, and you're not obtaining the goods for resale. As long as they're end-use goods, it's a consumer purchase, and hand it back to them. Now, we've actually tested this. It was tested in Winnipeg for minor. It was a chocolate bar. But they followed the procedure. They accepted the bill, accepted for value, returned such and such consumer purchase, handed it back to the merchant. The merchant put it in an envelope, sent it to the Receiver General, which is another topic in itself. And about 2 weeks later, the merchant got a check for the cost of the bill to settle his books. So we know this is there. We know it works. Whether it's going to work for something big, I don't know. I was trying to get some merchants in a couple of the towns that I lived in to try this out, particularly like mom and pop grocery stores, which would be a major boon for them if we could make this work the way it's supposed to work, the way it's the legislation is written. At which point somebody comes in, I don't have any money, that's fine, fill your card up, here's the bill, do this to the bill, sign it, date it, whatever. The purchase is done, and the merchant's books would be balanced, because everything's already paid for. Or in this country. I mean,
yeah, this basically comes about simply because of the fact that, pretty much every country now is in bankruptcy, and there's no legal or lawful money, I should say, in existence. So everything is done through the bills of exchange.
Yep.
A valid piece of legislation in every single Commonwealth country, and quite a few countries that are not in the Commonwealth, because it's how we are supposed to do business or function. Let's not say business. Let's say that's how we're supposed to function in society and commerce with each other in a system that is bankrupt. Yep. That's how it works.
And if you question the idea that the country is bankrupt, look at why they have a Receiver General. What is a receiver? What is the purpose of that office? And it's all tied to bankruptcy. The purpose of the receiver is to settle the bills. That's it. That's his entire job. And it ties into the birth certificate. It ties into your birthright in whatever country you're in, because you have a right to a percentage of the prosperity of that country if you were born there. And I believe in 1988, some college students did the math. And in 1988, every single man, woman, and child in Canada was worth $15 billion. That was their share of the lands and resources of this country. Yet we can't access it.
Yeah, well, I think they're up to 1.6 trillion. The gross domestic product of Canada.
Yeah, you got to keep in mind to do that accurately. You have to look at it in gold, because gold hasn't changed. Gold, the value of gold is the same now as it was 200 years ago. The buying power of an ounce of gold is the same now as it ever was. The difference is the money is devalued. When you look at, excuse me, if you're looking at the price of gold, what's gold now? $1,200 an ounce. It's not that gold is more valuable. It's that the money is less valuable. The paper. And so if you really want to get this accurately, you need to look at it in the value of gold. And this is also why with my fee schedule for any unlawful acts, I get paid in Canadian gold maple leaf coin at face value, which is also why nobody's ever triggered my fee schedule. Because, you know, a $5 gold coin is an ounce of gold. So in their mind, they've got to spend $1,200 to pay me $5. And
actually, it's more than that, because that's $1,200 US as well. something like that. It shouldn't be US because it's a Canadian gold maple leaf coin. You're buying it from the Canadian Mint, but who knows? You know, that's even gets into. Well, it's an international value of gold. That's typically where you get that valuation from.
Okay. Either way. I mean, it's so hard to look at one of these things in a vacuum because it's not. It's tied to everything around it. And when you first start looking at this stuff, it's incredibly complex. But it'll get to the point where you can start seeing the little spiderweb of things in there. And at that point, you'll see where your remedy lies and what you can do. You know, I have to stress, if you cause harm, loss, or damage, deal with it. Okay? Don't try to get out of it. Don't try to derail the process. Solve the problem. Settle the matter. If it's something stupid, like you get a ticket for crossing the street and there's nobody there, or you get a ticket for not turning on a turn signal when there's nobody there at 3 o'clock in the morning and there isn't anybody to see your turn signal, who gives a shit, right?
Yeah.
Those are the sort of things where we can actually affect change. And the change that we're looking to affect is to get people to question, especially the so-called authorities. And a lot of the police officers are just people. You know, some of them are definitely steroid-infused thugs who are there simply because they like to hurt people. They like that, you know, they're sadists and they want to cause problems. But a lot of them are just really just people. And they're confused. They've never been taught this stuff. They've never been taught to question where their authority comes from, where their limits are. And it's infused into them. It's the same with, you know, it's just like a military training where they break you down, they turn you into a pile of mush, and then they build you up the way they want you to. And you don't have the resources to question anymore. So what we need to do with these processes, it's not to get away with stuff, okay? This is all this whole thing is
all done in honor.
That's right. All of these teachings, they're not to teach you to get away with stuff. They're to teach you ways that you can educate. And it's through this education that we're going to affect change. And that's the crux of this whole thing, is to learn the verbiage, learn the processes, learn the logic that you can pass on to these people, so that the next time they encounter this, they go, wait a minute, excuse me, ma'am, are you driving or are you traveling? And then the lady's kind of, I don't know, I guess I'm driving. And, well, what commercial activity are you traveling, or you engaged in? And, you know, and begin to break this down and make the distinctions once again, because the distinctions were there not that long ago. It's only probably 40 or 50 years where that distinction was available and readily used. It's only in the last little while where that distinction has become not recognized anymore. And we need to begin the process of having these distinctions recognized again.
Yeah, most of the legislation that relates to highway traffic acts and driving and even tort offences were all redrafted in the 60s, typically in the UK, because that's where I was a police officer for a number of years. So yeah, most of the legislation was actually redrafted in the 60s, mid to late 60s. And prior to that, you'll probably find that a lot of other slightly older legislation would have been done again in about the 40s, just after the war. Previous to that, there wasn't all that much in the way of legislation. It was before the 1900s.
Yep.
And then it was so small and minute that because everybody lived under common law, so to speak, they knew what was right and wrong, and the codified legislation that existed was typically for serious offences, and how to deal with that. Because people would always come up with some kind of a defence. So they'd write new pieces of legislation to deal with people coming up with the defences to certain mechanisms. Because they weren't accepting responsibility, they were trying to get away with things. So they brought the codes in to cut out the loopholes, so to speak. But then it's just gone stupid. Now it's legislation for everything.
Oh, it's ridiculous out there. I mean, I can guarantee that anyone in this country, it doesn't matter who you are, whether you're a cop or a judge or Joe Average, you are in detail, you are committing at least 5 to 10 offenses every day. Because, like I said, there's 60 million statutes in this country. Do you know even a third of those? Do you have any idea that putting your shoes on the left shoe at the first is an offense? I mean, yes, that's ridiculous, but some of these are that ridiculous. And
well, here's one for you, John. As far as I know, it's still on the books in the UK. I'm not sure if it's in Canada, but this is a prime example of how you can be, as a police officer, to put it bluntly, you can be a real dick, because every single vehicle or car or conveyance that's on the road, according to the legislation, must have a bale of hay in the trunk, or boot, as they call it in the UK.
Yeah, I think in Vancouver there's one that I believe it's still there that says that when traveling at night, your footman must be 50 paces ahead with a red lantern.
Yes, yeah. There's still some of those, I think, on the books in the UK too, as well as probably other parts of Canada.
And I mean, it's
that's there. Going back so far, Yeah. Oh, if you're a cop and you want to be a dick, well, where's your footman? Where's your lamp? And here's your ticket.
That's right. Chances are it's not going to happen, because I mean, you could pretty much laugh at it. But if they really want to push it, yes, it's there. And unless you know about it, you have no defense. You have no way of getting around it. I mean, it's completely ridiculous. If you're in a car traveling down the road, you're not going to have a footman running at 60 miles an hour in front of you with a red lantern. It's just foolish. So, I mean, you could really raise a stink over that and probably get it changed if it ever came up, which is probably why it never comes up. But it's still there. And the point is that a lot of these are so completely ridiculous that there's just no logic behind them. And if you spend any time looking through the legislation, I mean, Canley.org is an excellent site. You can go in there and read through all of this stuff. Read through the legislation, read through the provincial legislation, the federal legislation, all of that stuff. All of these acts and statutes that we are supposed to, or we are assumed to be subject to, which, half of them don't make any sense whatsoever. There's no reason for them to be there other than a control mechanism and to justify somebody's job.
Yeah, for government. Actually, this just brings to mind something that I did personally myself, because in Ontario we have OHIP. It's obviously called something different in BC and Manitoba and what have you, but it's the Ontario Hospital Insurance Plan. So it's how you get healthcare in Canada, or in Ontario in Canada. Now, I looked at the legislation for that, and it actually says that the manager of the plan shall issue a card. Now, we're getting into fancy terms again, but that shall is a very special word in law, because it means that the manager must, in English language, issue a card.
Yes, shall.
Not necessarily through an application.
Shall is an imperative in law. The word shall is an imperative. If they use must and may are synonymous. And if you take apart the legislation where you see the words must, then what you'll find is that is what is required for that legislation to have an effect. If they use the word shall, that is an obligation that you are required to have. And
or they.
Or they. It puts an onus on someone.
And in this case, that was exactly the point. And the reason I mention it is because I don't have an card. I did at one point in the past, but I haven't had one for, 10 years now. And I did have a requirement to go into hospital for some treatment. And I said, send me the bill. And they sent me a statement, which I then forwarded with a letter explaining exactly the legislation to the OHIP fund department down in Toronto. And I got a phone call probably 2 weeks later from somebody who was very knowledgeable, saying, we don't do this. And I said, yes, you do, because you haven't issued a card to me when the manager says that you shall, and I haven't received it. So you're going to take care of this bill. And they said, well, get back in touch with the hospital, tell them to re-input the card number, or the number that was associated with the name on the account, and it will go through, because previously it was shown as being expired. Now, the first event, the hospital didn't actually do anything. They called me. Actually, they sent a letter, and I called them. I said, did you re-input the number? No, we don't do that. It's expired. Why would we? I said, redo it, because I've already spoken with the OHIP people. We have an understanding, and if you resubmit it, it'll go through. And I never heard from them again on that one. It obviously went through. But I still haven't received a card, even though they told me that I'm supposed to have one. And I told them I'm supposed to have one.
Well, if you really want to dig into that, especially with healthcare, it is extremely unconstitutional for them to obligate anyone to pay or have documentation for healthcare. It is a human right. It's in the Declaration of Human Rights, which Canada is a signatory to. They cannot refuse you healthcare.
Exactly.
Now they're going to try. And again, just say, well, fine.
Well, it's under contract, John, isn't it? That's the problem. Yeah, it's contract, because sent in an application for a card, which then means we have to follow this process that then says we have to pay for certain things, or if not, then they will pay for them. But they should be paying for them full stop from right the get-go. There's no application. There's no. The Declaration of Human Rights, as you mentioned, means that anybody who is a signatory to it, and I think the US are also a signatory to that, will and must receive medical attention if it's required. And the reason why these, in quotes, illegal aliens are getting treatment where the Americans are having to pay and losing their house over treatment is because of that very UN declaration.
Yep.
And the fact that these illegal aliens are not signing up and applying for, Obamacare and God knows whatever else.
That's right.
Because that's contract. That's what it is. You signed up for it.
Yep. When you submit an application for registration, you are screwing yourself. To submit in law means to beg. Who begs? An application. You're seeking a contract. When you apply for something, you are looking to make an agreement. Registration is you're signing away your rights. So you're begging for a contract to sign away your rights when you submit an application for registration. That's exactly. It's that simple. folks. It's that simple. Question it. When and don't question the frontline guys. They haven't got a clue. I mean, if you're friends with some of them, you can sit down and talk to them over a glass of wine, invite them over for dinner and expose them to this that way. Don't do it at their job, because they don't know. All they have is a procedure they got to follow, and if they don't follow it, they freak out and their life is miserable. If you're going to question it, question their the higher ups, question their bosses and their bosses' bosses, and make an agreement with the people who should know this stuff, who it's their job to know this stuff. Go right to the top, go right to the Minister of Health, and make an agreement with the Minister of Health, whether it's a written agreement or it's a tacit agreement, doesn't matter, because they hold you to tacit agreements constantly. So why can't they be held to their own? And once you have that lawful excuse, things change, and you actually have power at that point. Not power to get away with stuff, but power to assert your rights. Now, rights, this is another huge topic. Rights are not given to you. Rights are given to a slave. They're given to property. You have rights, okay? And the only way you obtain these rights is you claim them. So you claim the right to do this, and then say, why can't I? Right? And if they can't answer your questions, you have that right. You have claimed it, and it is your right to do such. Now, always keep in mind, your rights end where another's begin. So you can't claim the right to infringe on someone else's rights. That's absolutely wrong. That's what all of this law is about. That's why it exists in the first place, is because people will not take the responsibility of letting go of their rights where they infringe on another's. And we have to do that. You have to put the other person's rights ahead of your own.
Yeah, and that's what I was referring to before. When 1900 was tort based. You were infringing on somebody else's rights and created or caused harm, and they had the legislation, the codified common law to deal with it, rather than just an accepted, this is right and wrong and this is how it should be dealt with. No, this is now codified in legislative law. Here's how it's written. Beyond 1900, then we started getting stupid, and of course we find ourselves today where just about everything is codified, even to the extent of where a cop can search you in a public park and things like that. It's ridiculous.
Yep. It all comes down to we're losing our historical perspective. And historically, if you caused a problem, you went to the person you caused a problem with and go, look, I'm sorry I caused a problem. How can we settle this? And you did it privately first. If you could not come to a settlement, if the person was absolutely unreasonable or you were absolutely unreasonable, then the courts could step in. And that's the way it's supposed to be. If two parties have a dispute and they simply cannot come to a resolution, then an arbitrator is brought in. The arbitrator arbitrates a equitable remedy for both parties. That's what it's supposed to be. And that's actually a really good system. It works really well when it's done properly, but it's been taken completely out of control. The people who would normally be brought in as arbitrators realized, hey, there's a shitload of money to be made here if we let them forget they're supposed to do it themselves. And it's, again, it's all tied together. A lot of that comes down to money. A lot of it comes to control systems. The idea that I'm a judge and I have power, that plays into it. Ultimately, you should be seeking remedy from anyone you've harmed first. That's the lawful, the actual correct way to do this. If you damage or harm somebody, fix it. If you can't fix it, then someone is going to step in and make sure it is fixed. because it has to be. I mean, in any society, in any group of people living together, there's going to be conflict. Every once in a while, things are just not going to work out. If the two parties who are having conflict are reasonable and honest and responsible people, they will find a solution. They will come to some medium, some that's going to be acceptable to both parties.
Well, here's a prime example of that as well, John. When you something as simple as marriage as a relationship between two people, everything's all good. You get together, you get married, but then there's a later point where, well, okay, this hasn't worked out the way we wanted it to, and for whatever reason, now we've got divorce. These days, every single divorce will go through into a court system, will involve divorce lawyers, and that is not needed. If you can simply establish that you are two adults and making an arrangement between yourselves about how you're going to settle your affairs, then the last stage of it is that unfortunately you do have to go and file everything with the court, for the simple reason that you made the mistake of acquiring or applying for a license for marriage in the first place. And that means that you have to finalize everything in a court of law at the end of it. But you don't have to go through a lawyer's process where they take 60% of everything that both of you own anyway in legal fees, because they're charging $400 and $500 an hour, which most people don't earn in a bloody week.
Yeah.
So again,
that's awesome, excellent way to look at it, but that's looking at it as a social convention. Marriage is actually a corporate merger. When you
yes.
go and get your marriage license, when all of that stuff, you're actually registering a merger of two corporations together. And this is why they have the government, the powers that be, have the right to step in and force you to do these things, is because it's dissolving two corporations, and they have jurisdiction over corporate affairs because you've registered it. They're the trustee of those two corporations. They have to make sure that everything is equitable once that's done, which it rarely ever is. But they get their cut, they get their percentage, and that's all that really matters to them. In a common law situation, if you're reasonable about it and the two people simply can't get along, then you sit down and you split it up. It's a social convention. Whatever you came in with, you leave with, and anything you developed from that point on is you equitably divide the resources. Now, there was along that line, there was a thought process that went along with the product of the marriage, which are the children, as product. Mm-hmm. And that got really complicated, really heated. Lots of people got really upset over it. But it is part of the thing that you have to think about. And from a corporation standpoint, yeah, the product of a marriage is not going to be stuff. It's not going to be a house, a car, or a swimming pool. It's going to be the children. So when you go to divide up those corporations, you have to divide up the children. Now, you could do it with a chainsaw, or you could do it through the courts and this so-called custody stuff. I mean, why would someone have to sue for custody if it's their own children?
Because they're not your children to start with.
That's right, because you've registered them. They're not your children. They're the property of the state. So any time when you need to look at a license, when you need to look at registration, when you need to look at obtaining permission, look at why. Look at the mechanism behind it. What would be the point of this? Now, if what you were planning to do is going to cause harm, loss, or damage, then a license would make sense, because then some third party is going to go, well, let's mitigate the harm, let's mitigate the loss. They will be liable for the harm, loss, or damage. And they will issue a license, they will issue permission for you to do that act, whatever that act happens to be. And as an example, fishing comes to mind. Now, if you're going to go down to the river and fish, There is the possibility that you could deplete the resources, okay, which is you're stepping on everybody else's right to have a fish. So, yeah, I could see why some control would be required. I mean, if it was absolutely wide open, some guy'd go down there and they'd throw out a gill net, they'd catch 10,000 fish, and they'd leave 2/3 of them in the ditch to rot, waste the rest of them just because they can. And I don't want to bring up any specific groups, but we've seen this happen numerous times historically. So, yeah, okay, I could see that. But if that comes back to the soccer mom. If you're a soccer mom and you're taking your kids to practice, why do you need permission to do so? You know, where's the purpose of having the permission? You know, phone somebody up. I'm going to take my kids to soccer. You okay with that? Well, yeah, sure, go ahead. Okay, got permission. But so question it honestly, honorably, and if there is the opportunity for harm, loss, or damage, then accept the responsibility of that, and either get the consent of the people who are going to be affected, which is the right way to do it. If you have to drive through someone's field to get to where you got to go to that person and say, hey, look, on Tuesday I got to drive through the field. Is there a way I can get through there without causing you problems? And come to a private agreement first. That way we can eliminate all of this bullshit legislation that is being imposed on us. Because if they come and go, well, you have to have a license for that, it says, no, I don't. I have their permission. The license is no longer required.
Yeah, it's about the personal responsibility, being adult about the whole thing. What's happened over the last 100 years or more is simply that they've taken away not so much our ability to be or act as adults, but the reason to act as adults, because they've now put everything under legislation and they've insured everything for this, that, and the other, and we hold no personal responsibility in our lives.
Exactly. I this came up for me in a big way when I was awarded the status of Road Star years ago. Before I learned this stuff, I just followed the rules. I thought I was doing it right, and I had my license, and I insured my car, and all of this stuff, and I got to the status of Road Star. And they sent me a letter going, congratulations, you're now a Road Star. You have a free accident. And that sent off bell in my head and went, what? Free accident? What do you mean? And I started looking into it, and I could go and kill somebody, and they just, well, okay, no problem. You know, you lost your Road Star, but it's not going to cost you anything. It taking away the responsibility that I normally would take on to conduct my affairs in a manner that's not going to affect anyone else adversely. I think I brought this up last week. You know, if you're out on the roads traveling from A to B, would you rather be there with 500 people who are not insured and who are absolutely personally responsible for their actions, or 500 people who have free accidents? Think about that for a little while. And, you know, if they have no personal responsibility, if they are not liable for their actions, they're going to do whatever they bloody well please. People will do that because we haven't been taught personal responsibilities. None of the kids are taught this. They're not taught consequence. They're taught punishment. Punishment doesn't work. If you punish a kid, all he's going to do is figure out a way to get around the punishment. If you teach him consequence, there's no getting around consequence. And they will learn not to do this. That's the way to teach people right from wrong, is not punishment, it's consequence. And this is...
and that really makes a mockery of a lot of the law. Punishment,
big
not
time.
Consequence.
Big time. You know, I mean, you can look at it in a very obtuse way and say, well, the consequence of that is jail time. But no, the consequence of that is harm to another. And that harm is going to trickle down and affect you eventually, because I don't want to get into the new age stuff, but some of it is really accurate, and that is, we are all one. What you do to another is going to affect you eventually. It's going to cause you problems, either through ridiculous legislation or directly because you're going to piss off the neighbors and they're not going to talk to you anymore. There's going to be a consequence to it, and you need to look at that. And that's what personal responsibility is all about, is looking at how you are going to affect those around you. If what you're doing doesn't affect anybody around you, awesome. You got no worries. If you're going to paint your fence purple and you know it's going to drop the property value of everybody else and you're going to annoy 15 people on each side of you, then you need to either rethink your color or go to those people and say, look, this is what I'd like to do. Is this an issue? And if it is an issue, you come to a solution for that issue. That's what personal responsibility is all about. And it's so critical that we bring this back. It is so lost in everything. Like the Roadstar, the insurance, car insurance is a prime example of that. Where what do I care? I'm insured. Who cares if I hurt somebody? I'm insured. I don't care if I run over somebody's dog. I'm insured. That's not the way to think about it. The way to think about it is, you run over somebody's dog, you're taking away a family member. How would you feel if somebody took away your family member? Would you be happy that they're insured so they're not liable for it? No, of course not. You want payback. You want them to be responsible for their actions. And if you can accept that you would require them to be responsible for their actions and make amends, then you also have to accept that for yourself. And very few people do that. Very few people think of it that way. It's always one-sided. I'm insured. I don't care. But if it happens to them, they're pissed.
Yeah.
Well, Carl, I'm running out of stuff to talk about. Have you got anything any stories you want to tell, or? I'm sorry, I'm starting to repeat myself, so I want to move on if I can.
No. Well, I mean, certainly we were talking about the products of registration and licensing, and I think I just want to instill, and really we've spoken about this over the last few weeks, and how they get the jurisdiction and so on. And what I kind of want to suggest to people, how many times this goes on in your life, and the fact that you have to be forever vigilant. And I spoke to John off air earlier on, probably yesterday, I think, about this, and it gets to the point where everything that you do, because it's contractual based and it's down to an agreement, there are ways that you can help yourself. Because if it wasn't, as John's pointed out, it's slavery.
That's right.
And that's been banned for a very, very long time. Very, very long time, but certainly a long enough time and well before our lifetime. And literally everything that we do has become a contract or an agreement that gives the other party permission to be able to do this to us. Because if we hadn't, then it would be slavery. So I started from the point of, let's start from the man and the woman. Boyfriend, they get together. They decide that they're going to get married. Now, ignore the fact of prehistory and the fact that this has been going on prior to their birth anyway, but these are the first two. The first thing that they get told, they need a marriage license, so they apply for a license. We've just spoken about what a license is. They get married. Eventually they get a child, and they then register that child into the system. We also know what registration is. That you're actually handing across the rights and the power of control over whatever that property might be, or person in this case, or baby, child, to whoever you're registering it to, which of course is the government. So that's the next step in how they form that contract between you, because you've registered, because you've applied for a license. You've given permission at that point to whatever it is you're applying or registering. There's a certain set of rules that apply to that. So by applying for a license, it means that the government and legal system is in bed with your corporate entities, with you within your marriage, so that if you should ever get divorced, then they have a right to step in and deal with your affairs, which includes your children. Now, as you go through life, the child grows up. The next step, you register for daycare. Okay, that might be a private thing, if it's certainly a private daycare, which is fine. That's a private contractual arrangement. But if you're arranging daycare through the state, again, the state is the corporation that controls. And if you're registering through that, then there are certain requirements like vaccinations, etc., that go along with that. Same when you register for a public school. Same thing goes. Now, there are ways that we can offset that a little bit, certainly in Canada, because we all have our rights not to be harmed and not to be injured. Unfortunately, by registering and applying for licenses, we sort of give away our power when we do that. And the control that the governments and their offshoots and departments will then try to instill upon you and your children becomes almost absolute, unless you can fight them off, because you really do have the rights. And you can say, well, no, I don't want vaccinations for my child. And we can do that certainly in Canada for conscientious and religious grounds. Maybe that's a bit of a defense, but we still have the right, really, not to allow anybody to injure our children. Next steps, you're going through school. You probably have many other applications and registrations to go through processes as adults and as your children. Next step really is social insurance numbers, social security numbers. That's another contract. By applying for those, that makes you liable for income tax, among a few other things. But again, you've signed a contract, you've made an agreement that by doing this, you are then bound by the rules that go along with that contract. You get a little bit older. You decide that you don't want to work for an employer. You decide, I'm going to do this for myself. And you start your own business. Well, what do? You register the business. So what does that do? It means that you must, at that point, follow the rules of the registration, which then means you have to file your income, which is another issue in itself. You have to pay taxes on that income. And you also get to a point where the rules state that if you earn this amount of money, which I think in Canada is about $30,000, then you have to start acting as a tax collector for sales tax, and you have to, at that point, start charging and collecting sales tax for the government, which you must then give to them.
There is a loophole in that.
Again, yeah, there is. Yeah, but I'm just saying that the very process of you registering, and you basically, when you registered your business, you gave over title to your business to the government or whoever it is that you're registering it to. And in the consequence of doing that is that there are certain rules that you must abide by and follow when you do that. Everybody has the right to run and create their own business. There is really no requirement in law or anywhere that you must register that business, but everybody does it. Everybody applies for a social insurance social security number. Again, that is just an employment identification number with the government.
You can test
and
this
if you
too.
apply for it,
you can test.
Yes. Yeah. No. Go ahead, John. Go ahead.
You can test that too. If you go down to whatever Service Canada, whatever it's called in your area, and ask them for a replacement employee identification number, they're going to go, "Oh, you mean your social insurance number?" They know this.
Yeah, exactly. They know. They know what it is.
They know exactly what it is. So you can. That's a little something you can test that. If you want, and get some validity on that thing. Something came to mind. I don't want to interrupt your chain of thought, but I'd like to get this out. Something came to mind because everything is contract. Why not? I mean, we would have to research this. This is just a concept that I just thought of today. Instead of registering your children with the state, why don't you register them with your parents? Make a contract with your parents as trustees of your kids. That way, if the state wants control of that, they're going to have to come up with a lawful way to dissolve a private contract with your parents, which they can't do. And that may give you lawful excuse to tell the state to go take a flying leap when they demand registration, because they're already registered. Sorry. It's already been.
There's a pre-existing arrangement. Which they would have to overrule.
That's right, and as long as you did it properly, and the agreement is valid, then they're going to have a really hard time doing that. Now, it used to be the only registration you would have to do is you would put them in your family Bible, which is you're recording it. Under registration, by legal definition in the Black's Law, legislation is to record it. So if it's already recorded, why does it have to be recorded again? Right? So just something to think about. It's just a mental exercise. Perhaps it is the solution, the remedy that a lot of these people are seeking, is to keep it in the family, keep it in the private, and the public. A public entity cannot step on private contracts because the private is the superior law. Common law is the superior law. And the corporation, because of its nature, being that it doesn't exist in the first place, has a really hard time dealing with anything that is already set in the private. So have a look at that. If you're researching this, if you're looking for some sort of remedy, have a look at setting something up in the private before it gets to the point where the public entities have to step in or want to step in.
Yeah, so this is obviously going to be prior to the birth itself, because at that point the nurses and the doctors are all over you to sign, so that the next step is they can stick them with vaccines and God knows what else, which you can say no. Well, you don't have the right to do that. Even
the vaccine thing, this is a big one that's come up recently, is these vaccine things. And there's a document available on the net called this Physician's Warranty of Vaccine Safety. If you look that up, you'll find it. And what it is a form that when the doctor says you have to have the vaccinations, or the nurse says you have to have the vaccinations, you hand them this form, say, awesome, here, fill this out. And what it does is it creates a contractual obligation for that practitioner to take full liability for the vaccine. And they will not do that. Again, this gives you lawful excuse to tell everybody to go take a flying bleep.
Yeah, exactly. And as it happens, I have a Canadian of that form.
Yeah, I mean,
if I can find, I will post.
I've been sending it to all of the groups that vaccines. How am I going to fight this? I send it to everybody, and what it actually is, we've spoken about this before, and it's what's called a conditional acceptance, and it's a way to stay in honor, keep your hands clean, where you're not refusing anything. I mean, that's the one of the really big secrets to this, to getting through with all of the contract stuff, because it is all contract, is a conditional acceptance. Certainly, I'm happy to wash your floor as long as I get paid $1,000 a square. And they can't say he refused to wash the floor, because you didn't. You agreed to wash the floor, but because you're not a slave, you're going to get paid for it. And make the conditions such that, first of all, they're honorable, they make sense, but they are such that the other party will not accept that condition. At which point, they're the ones in dishonor. They're the ones that said no, not you. And your hands are clean. It doesn't always work, but it's a major tool that you can use.
Well, most of the time, they may try and come around, later or some different way, but at that moment in time, most people, nurses and doctors, are definitely not going to sign that form. And I've just put a link down in the chat there with the Canadian version. I can't seem to find the one I had for the US, but it's basically the same, and you could even amend it anyway, so that you could point to the US wording. But yeah, that's all that's an way to proceed, simply because, again, you're bringing it out of the public and into a personal, private contract and an arrangement that takes the state's insurance policy away from them, because that's pretty much how most of the authorities and the people in these corporations act and exist. They believe there's some form of exemption for them within the job that they have that allows them to do whatever they want to anybody.
Yep.
Which, as we've already discussed, is slavery. That's allowed. So we take it, we remove that presumption from them and say, okay, well, if you want to proceed that way, then I'm going to remove the insurance policy from you, and here is a form that I am personally going to hold you liable for this, because you are the one that wants to do this. Now, in the case of vaccines, you are the one who wants to administer it. You are the professional. I am the pleb, so to speak. I don't really know what this is. So you being the professional, I want your recommendations and I want your assurances. So if you can give them to me, by all means sign that form, and I will let you inject whatever into my child. But, and here's the big one, if there is any harm caused by that, I am coming after you, because you signed this form. And not only that, I'm coming after your job, I'm coming after your house, I'm coming after your car, and I'm coming after your children's earnings.
Yeah. And
do you understand this?
Yeah, the power of a conditional acceptance, particularly with vaccines. We'll stick with that because that's where we're at right now. You take your kid into the school. They go, well, has your kid been vaccinated? You say no. Well, he's not allowed in the school. Well, I took him to be vaccinated and they refused. It's not my fault. This is where the power of the conditional acceptance comes in.
As long as you've some form of not so much an excuse, but certainly you have a reason why certain things have not been done. But of course, when it comes to vaccinations, and there are other ways around it, such as, I think Crystal mentioned it there, there's the exemptions under conscientious and religious grounds. So as long as you have that form and have lots of copies of the original, preferably, because they always ask for it, provide it to them. Mm-hmm. But then also make sure, as part of the personal responsibility, that once your child is of a certain age, that they can understand things, that you must tell them that if anybody, nurse, school, or otherwise, approaches you and says you have to take this vaccination or have this needle stuck in your arm or wherever, you say no. You must say no, because you as a parent can't be there 24/7.
Yeah.
And these people will take an advantage, whether there's an exemption form there or not. And once that needle's been stuck and the damage has been done, I mean, these people we know that autism is a consequence of vaccinations. There's now CDC provided evidence of such, along the peer-reviewed resources out there that you can see on the net. You know, this is about protecting your child, because when all's said and done, that doctor, that nurse walks away having done their job, and then you have to look after an autistic child for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
They have no responsibility, and neither does the drug company, because the government has given them blanket exemption too.
Yes.
Again, there's the insurance thing.
If you're going to try to hold these people accountable for this, you can't use words like autism, because autism is not defined.
Correct. Yeah.
They'll just laugh at you. It has to be something very specific. There was a court case that just came up, and it was in fact an autistic spectrum disorder, but they worded it in such a manner that they were very specific about the actual condition that they were complaining about, and they won their case because it was defined, it was provable, it was there. There was no question that this was going on, and they were able to tie it to the chemicals. But be very careful in your wording. This is I've mentioned this a number of times. All of this law stuff is all word games, and if you don't use the right words, you will lose. They will wipe the floor with you. So be very careful about the words you use. Be very careful about the terms and the way you put your words together. It's very, very important. When you're writing a conditional acceptance, again, the words are important, but it's a little bit easier because it's a private contract. So you're not using legalese at that point. You're using plain English. And you can even define that in the contract. You know, the terms in this document are as found in the Webster's Canadian Dictionary, whichever, which eliminates some ambiguity. If you can read a sentence in your document and interpret it more than once, interpret it in several different ways, that sentence should not be in the document. There should be no ambiguity whatsoever in your documents. Be very clear, be very precise in your language, and be honorable. I mean, don't try.
Actually, just on that subject, John. Sorry, I just didn't.
Go ahead.
Clarify on the subject of ambiguity in a contract as well. You have to be aware, as John is just warning, that the words that you use may well come back and bite you, because if you're not clear on the meaning of anything that's in your contract, then under contract law, you as the person drafting it will lose if there's any ambiguity in it, because they will interpret it to not benefit you. Exactly. You will not get the benefit from it. It's ambiguous within the contract. So again, make sure it's ironclad and that you know both parties know exactly what's being said.
Yeah. If you need some practice at this, I don't really recommend going full bore with this process, but there's a fella named Miller. I wish I could remember his first name. He has developed, or he is advocating, a system called quantum syntax grammar. And it is a way to write a document or write a sentence or several sentences in a way that they cannot be misinterpreted. And he says this is the only way to do it. He could very well be right. But if you look at the way the sentences are put together, how they mean exactly the same thing, frontwards, backwards, any way you look at it, there is only one possible interpretation for that sentence. It's a good way to get your mind wrapped around how to generate that document so that it cannot be interpreted in a second manner. The quantum syntax language, it's complicated at first glance, but once you get it, once you get the mathematics behind generating those sentences, it's actually pretty easy, and you can do it, and so that regular people can understand what you're reading or comprehend what they're reading. But the meaning of that sentence, the meaning of that phrase, is exactly one meaning, and that's really important when you're writing this stuff up. Is that I can't stress it enough. If it can be interpreted in a second way, it will be interpreted in a second way. And there's nothing you can do about that. So stop that right from the beginning. Yeah. I think I brought this up the first time. Whenever you're dealing with these people, kill their objections right from the very first piece of paper you send them. If you go through, think about how they're going to object to this and what mechanisms they're going to use to try to pin you down, and destroy those mechanisms right off the bat. Take away their toys immediately. And the quantum syntax grammar does that in an amazing way, but it's difficult to work with unless you're really good at it. But it's a good way to learn how to write in such a manner that it's absolutely clear. So have a look at that. See if it works for you. Some people are going to get it right off the bat. I looked at it and I kind of got it right off the bat. I'm not really good at it, but I understand how it works, and I'm able to write sentences that they can only be interpreted in one way. And that's really, really important, especially when you're writing up things like a conditional acceptance or a private contract. Now, if you're honorable, the private contract is, I'll do this, you do that. Okay, awesome. Shake your hands and it's done. Honorably, that is the contract. But a lot of cases, people are going to try to get away with stuff, so you have to actually put it down in paper. And even with my friends, if we make an agreement, I'd like to see, I tell them, can we put this in paper so that it doesn't change? Because people's memories change. And in a year, they may not remember all of the details. So let's put it on paper so the details don't change. It's not to hold you to anything. It's just so that there's no conflict come up later. There's no questions about what we just discussed here, which is, an honorable, honest thing to do. And it's not that I don't trust them.
It's frustrating as well, though, John, because I deal in private contracts too, and the majority of people that I deal with, it's a verbal agreement, it's a shake of a hand, and that's the way I like to do, I won't say business because it's commerce and what have you, but that's certainly the way I like to deal with other people. If I'm a little unsure, then yes, then okay, let's write something down so that we understand exactly what it is that we're agreeing to, and that our memories are good, if that's the case.
Yeah, it's kind of
it moves us away from that responsibility and that personal honesty that we all should have. Okay, memory is an issue sometimes, and we forget. So I understand that point, but there shouldn't be a question. There shouldn't be a question as to the aspects of the contract, and that's what we've got to get away from and understand.
It's a learned bit of human nature. It's not actually the way things should be. If all things being equal, without the control system influence, this probably wouldn't occur. So I consider it a learned human nature. To your memory alters over time. You don't remember things the same way you did 6 months ago, and it's not a good or bad thing. It just is. So that's why I suggest this. And
I guess it depends on the depth of the agreement as well.
Oh, yeah, definitely. If how much is there to available to lose? If I want to borrow your lawnmower for a week and I forget it's 10 days, then so what? It's 10 days, no big deal. Give him his lawnmower back. Mm-hmm. But if it's borrow the car and you make sure that it comes back perfect and full of gas, and it comes back with a dent in it and it's empty and it comes in a tow truck, then yeah, I mean, that's extreme. I'm pulling it out of my butt, just trying to come up with something to talk about. But I think you get the idea. The severity of the potential breach of the contract should determine, how important it is to get it in writing.
Yeah. So actually, just I put the links in the plenipotentiary judge for the quantum language.
Yes, David Wynn Miller. That's his name.
Yeah. So I've just put some links in the chat there for anybody to follow.
Yep, and some of his stories, he talks about some stories. One of the stories was a business who had parking spaces, and they wanted to reserve their parking spaces for their customers. And they put up a sign, unauthorized parking will be towed, and nobody ever listened to it. So he came and he made a sign, and he said, if I remember correctly, the wording was, for the fee for the parking is with the crushing and the melting. And nobody parked there.
Yeah.
Because it was crystal clear.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it sounds a little goofy, but prepositional phrases are very, very precise, very accurate phrases. And this is the point. This is why that language, that type of language exists, is because it is so precise.
And but it's not something that you could maybe write it down, because the way it's contextually written and the way it's put together, it's very difficult for you to speak that way. But obviously, if it's written down, it's easy for you to understand what's being said.
Yes, and I would
comprehend.
I would be very curious to see what effect an affidavit would have written in quantum syntax grammar. I would actually like to see the face of the whoever's official is the first time he looks at it, because he's probably going to throw up.
Well, I know the affidavits, they're like written in a particular way, even to the extent that I had to draft one recently, and I put my name in lowercase, and the lawyer threw a fit.
Yep.
Because he said, no, that's not accepted. And I said, I don't care if it's accepted or not. It's my accepted way of commonly being referred to.
Yep.
And I don't like being referred to in the Capitis Maximus way.
Yeah, well, one of the really easy ways to get through that is you look at them square in the eye and you say, are you saying that I am obligated to commit identity theft? And if they know what that capital letter means, they're going to get really nervous, and they're either not going to deal with you, or they're going to bend over backwards trying to make this work for you. Because they don't want to be held liable for identity theft, because they know exactly what that is. And even the cops know what that is. And that's one of the, a simple question that you can expose the legal name fraud right off the bat. And I mentioned a number of times, anybody who's going to embark on this, that's the goal, is to expose it instantly. The first question you ask should expose everything. And that way, they know what legal footing they're on, what the game is, and chances are they're not going to want to play with you, because they do not want this exposed.
Yeah, and if you're dealing with cops, well, that depends on what kind of cop you get, realistically. And more often than not, that's your first dealing with this kind of thing. It's the cop on the street. And if you can't deal with that, then you have to go the next step before it gets into the court system. And it becomes progressively harder and harder as you go along that route.
Yes.
But the whole point and the idea is to make this as simple as possible for everybody, so that your first contact is to shut this whole process down, rather than having to deal with it later and unravel what's been forced upon you because you weren't able to deal with it in the first place.
Yeah.
And that's typically what everyone's complaint is. I've got this ticket now, and now I've got a court appearance that I have to go to. A whole host of other things. I've got the doctor, they're bringing social services because I didn't vaccinate my child. I want to get I want to get divorced. The lawyer's coming at me and they want to charge $10,000 just to, dissolve my marriage. The list is endless. The government and the system in control, the hooks that they have into our life. And the whole point is just to make it simple to get those hooks out of your life and simplify your way of living.
Yep. I mean, each situation is going to be different, certainly. Even, the same type of situation between different individuals is going to be somewhat different. But typically, you could come up with 3 or 4 questions right off the bat, the first interaction that's going to completely derail the whole thing. And from that point on, they will not act after that because they have to answer the questions first. And what those questions are, I can't tell you. I can give you an idea of what sort of things to look for in those questions, but because it's chess at 60 miles an hour, each time they come up, they're going to be slightly different questions. But the point is to expose the fraud instantly. The very first, as soon as you open your mouth, make it clear that you are not going to play the game. You're going to play, you're not following their rules. You're not going to read their script. You're going to force them to be honest and honorable and answer the questions. And if they don't answer the questions, you have excuse to say, go away. Like with the taxes stuff, I'd be happy to pay income tax as long as you answer under penalty of perjury and oath that none of the money goes to war, genocide, illegal vaccinations, unlawful court actions, blah, 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 on and on and on and on. You could have a whole list of stuff on there. And that's an honorable thing to do. You want to make sure that you're not paying for criminal activity. So nobody can really blame you for it. But if they answer the questions, they expose, yes, it's all criminal activity, and that's what it's all about. So it gives you excuse to say, bugger off, I'm not paying you anything. Until you
mind you, if you're under a contract because you unwittingly registered or applied for something, technically speaking, you are liable for the processes and payment
then question
in relation to income taxes.
Then question the contract.
Yeah, or question the very fact that, is income tax, does it even apply to me, the man or woman?
If you think you're under a contract for something and you're going to be liable for that contract, then question the contract. And, look at the mechanism that they use to get you to assume you are liable for it and question those things. I mean, the whole point here is to ask questions they don't want answered. Regardless of what it is, whether it's a vaccination, like with the vaccinations, that questionnaire, the doctor, he's going to read that and he's not going to want to answer 90% of those questions, because if he does, he exposes that, yes, these are harmful and they're intended to cause harm. With the license, you ask questions to expose that in a private capacity, you don't need permission from anybody. As long as you're not causing harm, loss, or damage, or trespassing on the public roads, there's no fault. If you want to build a house and you have agreement from your neighbors don't care, build a house, go ahead, I don't care. Question why you have to have some third party come in and say, yes, it's built properly. I'm the one liable for this. If house inspectors, if they demand to have a house inspector, you make an agreement with the house inspector that if something does happen to go wrong in the future that he missed, he's liable for it. And no house inspector is going to say, I'm not inspecting the house. So you have lawful excuse. Well, I've called house inspectors and they refused. So apparently I don't need to be inspected. This is the thinking. This is the way that we can expose all of this stuff, gain lawful excuse, and stay in honor. And that's what this is all about. So anyway, that was an awesome discussion, Carl. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, John. I always enjoy the interactions and the conversation topics, and I just hope everybody else that's listening now and later really does learn something from it, because we just enjoy coming up with all the circumstances and all the information just for you guys. I just hope that you really do learn and lose the fear and stand up in your own right.
Yeah, well, for those that are listening after the fact, we'll have links to the room where we do this live, and it's every Sunday morning at 8:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And as long as we have interest, we're going to keep doing this stuff. We'd like to do a Q&A session one of these times, but we need a larger audience and get a bunch of people in the room so we can actually have a question. We don't mind debate. If you have things you like to discuss that seem that we're off track, by all means, bring it in. We'd love to discuss this because we learn too.
We're not saying that we know everything. It's spent John more so than me, because he's done it a few years longer than me, but we've both spent a lot of years going into this and researching this, and I must admit, I mean, my legal career as a police officer started early 80s, but I didn't really start waking up to what was really happening as a police officer until many years later. I had an understanding while I was actually operating as a police officer that what was happening wasn't what I wanted or expected. But again, it's a totally different thing. So yeah, we don't know everything. We love the challenge of being able to discuss what it is that you might have as a concern, or even a different way to go. This isn't set in stone. This is just possible tools that you can use that we believe will be very helpful, rather than being obtuse and obnoxious towards these people, acting because that's what it's all about, being honourable and acting in that honourable fashion, losing the fear, standing in your own right, and respecting the rights of others and their right to life and enjoyment of everyday living as well.
Most definitely.
So, John, yeah.
Well, that's awesome. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you again next week. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye, everybody.